Hey guys, welcome to the Joke Points. In this video, we're going to talk about something interesting called the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, and stay with me till the end because this is going to be an interesting video, and you will have a lot better picture of this whole entire Venezuela situation, geopolitics as a whole, and where this whole world order is actually headed. And I've been talking about this Venezuela situation for past 2 to 3 years. Okay, and on my Spotify and all that and I've talked about, in fact, I talked about all this to a point where I drew the whole entire map on my videos through the pen that, hey, this is what exactly the Western Hemisphere is going to look like. This is how each and every sphere of influence is going to look like. Okay. Now, today, we're going to talk about the Monroe Doctrine. Okay. So let's get started. Please do like and subscribe. All right. So let's go. So now, over the past few years, over the past year or so, we have been hearing about the whole entire, since the campaign, actually, if you ask me, that the media has revived this old phrase called the Monroe Doctrine, right? Now, Off late, of past couple of weeks or something, it has appeared only in what? In Venezuela, China's role in Latin America, ports, sanctions, currency systems, all that good stuff, right? But then when it comes to public framing, like in media and all general interviews and all, what happens, what we hear is, especially from President Trump, actually we hear about what? Crime, narcos, trace, drugs. Oh, we destroyed Venezuelan drug cartel, this, that, security threats and all that good stuff, fentanyl and everything else, right? All that they talk about. Now the question really is this, you have to ask yourself this question as to, if fentanyl and drug is the real problem, then why not start with Mexico? Why are you going after Venezuela? So clearly, drug may be one of the things. Drug could, because drug network can be used to fund lots of things. Okay, and Venezuela clearly has been linked with lots of illegal elections and all that thing too. But there are lots of other background things. But is that really the case? And since the Monroe Doctrine has been talked a lot, so that's what we are going to try to explore exactly, how this all this fits into the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, so when you look into all this, the trade, the drugs, all that, then you find out that actually US was losing its grip in its own hemisphere. Now today, if you look into it, right, for example, Canada doesn't listen. You talk to Canadians have their own thought process. Then Mexican cartels are basically making threats also openly. Oh, we will do this, we will do that. Then even Nicaragua is threatening. Then Cuba is like, okay, we will destroy America. Mm. Then bunch of roadside Venezuelan gang members threatening the world's strongest military in the police force. I mean, there are these gang members are threatening Americans, where the Americans have more guns than total American population. Can you believe this thing? Thousands and thousands rounds of ammunition is sitting in each and every household, and still people are, these all these gang members and all that were making threats. So that simply tells you that it means that US was losing its grip in on the Western Hemisphere. The influence, right? The influence, whether you create that influence being a bully, whether you create that influence with the power projection, whether with the soft power, right? All that, but all that is part of the influence. So when you are losing that influence, then lots of bad things happen to you, and the things start to happen, and you will start to see that uh, that effect inside in your system. Like for example, election will be compromised. You will see protests uh, about the American rights, but with Mexican and Venezuelan flags. Then you're gonna start to see lots of other unwanted things that will not even make sense. That people are burning American flags within America. How is that even possible? Right? How is that making America great again? It's a bad thing somehow, because lots of people have been hating on MAGA, so called, right? So So all that is because it all comes from the outside. It comes from outside, then the infiltration happens, and then the doors always open from inside. Just remember this thing, okay? When this even the Trojan horse, right? Remember the Trojan horse story? What happened? The gate was open from inside, not from outside. Okay, and that's the pretty much what the story has been for past couple of years within the country. Okay, now, so how all this that I'm saying ties to the Monroe Doctrine? Okay, just to look into all that, let's talk about the whole thing. Okay, let me first of all share my screen, and then I will get to you. Okay. Now, once again, don't when you look at this whole news thing that I'm showing you, so don't fall for it that they say, "Oh, I'm just gonna read this and blah blah blah." No, I'm just showing you the how the Monroe Doctrine has been in the news overall. Okay, now, so this is the news about this, and there's many more. I mean, if you Google it, you will see it. Okay, now, so what is a Monroe Doctrine? So Monroe Doctrine actually was announced in 1823 by the fifth president of the United States, James Monroe. So its core message was very simple. Okay, core message was that external powers must not project influence or control into the Americas. Americas meaning the whole entire Western Hemisphere, the North America and the South America. Now, the question really, what does that mean here? What are external powers? Okay, right? The most important question of all. One, let me start my pen here real quick so that I can actually talk a lot better, interactive, right? So the question really is the core message is that external powers must not project influence or control into the Americas. So who are the external power? External power, when it says external powers here, then external power simply means that the powers that are outside of the Western Hemisphere. Now, okay, so originally, the thing was that this whole this doctrine, okay, the doctrine was actually created when America was a fairly new country. Okay, this came out in 1823, and America's Independence Day was the 4th July 1776, right? So, so you will hear this in America a lot that, oh, if you violate the Second Amendment, right, then 1776 will commence again, and it will happen. Make no mistake. But that's not the discussion here. Okay, I'm just giving all that dates in the to put things in perspective. Okay, so America was fairly a 40-50 year old country. Okay, so it was vulnerable to the external threats. Okay, now, so when we say external powers, what external powers we are talking about here? External powers, clearly China wasn't there at that point. China was already dealing with its own problem. India was dealing with its own problems. Russians were there, yes. But other than that, the two great powers were just simply colonized, or they had their own thing to worry about. Okay. So what exactly the Monroe Doctrine was devised for, or designed for? Monroe Doctrine was designed for the European empires. Okay. Now, we will actually look into what European empires I'm talking about here. These European, not the neighboring states. You have to understand this. It was designed for to keep out the European empires. Okay, and those European empires, why those European empires? Now, to understand this, you will have to understand the history of the colonization. Okay, how Columbus went to America. Columbus was a European. He went to America. How a section of Europeans actually went to North America, South America, mainly the Spanish and all that. They went to South America, Latin America, and all that. Then another section of Europeans, it went to the Asian continents and all that. All right, to explore. So this is how it was all determined. And and this is why you see Mexico is a country in the Latin American continent, in the Latin America, but they speak Spanish. when Spain is in what? Spain is in Europe. So how is that possible? It's because of the colonization. They simply destroyed the Mexican language. Same thing with Latin America. What do you hear in Latin America, like in South America, Brazil, Argentina, then you have Paraguay, then you have Bolivia, all that, Venezuela, Colombia, all that. What do you hear? You hear different types of language, Portuguese or mainly Spanish. It's all because of the colonization. Okay. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure that they had their own languages if you start to look into it. Okay. So this is why it was the Monroe Doctrine was designed for European empires. Okay, European empires that used to explore the Western Hemisphere or the Americas. All right. Now, in the beginning, this doctrine was basically designed for designed for a defensive purposes, that okay, hey, just stay out of our sphere of influence. This is our area, you need to stay out of it. Don't try to spread your influence here. We are the boss, this that. Okay, defensive warning into a sphere of influence framework. They basically uh, worded it this way, they phrased it this way, that is sphere of influence. And I've talked about the sphere of influence many times in the past, and how this whole how each and every region has been already determined that what is this sphere of influence at this point. Okay, like I can actually draw all these things today too. Okay, and I will do that one more time. Okay, I will do that one more time with respect to the four great powers as to what exactly is gonna be the sphere of influence and how that's gonna play out. All right, so stay with me till the end. Okay, if you haven't liked and subscribed, please do it now. So Monroe Doctrine was never about never about trade balances or anything. It was about basically the who is allowed to operate strategically in the region, meaning that as long as some external country, some external power is trading fairly and not trying to militarize it or not trying to do something that is strategically hurtful to America. hmm, or say in a way that let's say probably uh, let's say for example currency, or let's say another thing would be, let's say, standing up another enemy, like like how Russians, Soviets did back in the day. They created the whole Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Cuba is right there in the backyard. Hmm? So something like that. What if there are more enemies already, like, or now if you look into it, you will see that Brazil already is basically a maverick. Brazil already is a maverick, but rebellious, and already talking about, oh, de-dollarization, we don't want America, this that, we have nothing to do with this and that, blah blah, all that, right? Then there are a few other countries. Argentina, yes, Argentina did join the dollar club, but they joined it for a different reason. Okay, but Venezuela, Colombia is already there. You saw in the beginning how Colombian president was talking crap about how they're gonna fight against tariff and this and that, right? So, and all that happens, they don't do these things in isolation. All that happens because they have somebody behind the scenes pushing them to do these things, pushing or basically showing a fake support, that yeah, we support you, yes, come on, do it, come on, do it. And and then when they FAFO, then it goes to a whole different level. Nobody's there. When you turn around, oh, we're alone, nobody's there. Hmm? So that's what Monroe Doctrine was all about. Monroe Doctrine was about it was a defensive posture to clearly define the sphere of influence and to warn any external power way ahead of time that, hey, this is the thing, this is the doctrine that we follow. So if you don't follow, then that's a red line for us, and there will be problem. So then after that, don't say that we didn't warn you. Okay, that's the whole the doctrine. Now, so when I say European empires, so what European empires exactly we are talking about here, right? And let's look at the whole entire list of the European empires during the James Monroe era. Okay, who were those empires? What were those empires? First of British Empire, Spanish Empire, Portuguese Empire, French, Dutch Empire, Denmark, Russian Empire, Austrian Empire, and Ottoman Empire. Now let's look at what they were doing. Colonial empire, okay? At that time, British Empire was a great power, okay? Then Spanish Empire, colonial empire. This was also a colonial empire. Portuguese, colonial empire. And then France, colonial empire, and it was a great power. They, because nobody was there, so they started to call themselves great power and all that, like British and France and all that. So then if you look into it, this was also a colonial empire. Okay, now if you look into their influence, Western Hemisphere, where what was their presence during that time? Canada, Caribbean colonies. Okay, Cuba, Spanish Empire, Cuba, and Puerto Rico as mainland colonies broke away. Okay, then Brazil, Portuguese Empire, Brazil until 1822. Then Brazil became independent. That's why Brazil is Brazil people. The Brazilians speak Portuguese as a language. Caribbean colonies. Okay, France had the influence in Caribbean colonies, right? Yeah. Then Dutch Empire. It seems like that everyone had the influence in the Caribbean. Caribbean seemed like were the easy ones. The Caribbean holdings in Suriname. Okay. Then Denmark, Danish West Indies. Okay. Saint Thomas, and basically they were all right around here. Then Russians were in Pacific outposts and Alaska mainly. So Russians were not as much of a threat as people make it out to be. Then Austrian Empire were non-existent in Americas. Okay, so this was never a problem, and this was never a problem because Ottoman Empire after World War I, Ottoman Empire was completely gone. Austrian Empire was also completely gone after World War I. Okay, this is what World War I did. World War basically killed the whole entire this colonial or say empire based imperialistic world order that was there of the Europeans. Okay, it completely destroyed it. Spanish Empire was gone, Portuguese Empire was gone, French were still present, but Dutch were gone, that Denmark was gone, and Russian Empire moved to socialist system and all that, right? So but still if you look into it, then pretty much here Brazil, Canada, Caribbean, Cuba, Brazil, Caribbean, all these empires had their influence in this region. Okay, so this is why especially this part right here. Okay, so this was done to warn them to stay out of the region. That's all it was. Okay, and now so this is where the whole entire European power system looked like. Okay, now if you look into it, then you find that uh, some of these empires actually still exist. They have transformed into the constitutional monarchy rather than a full-fledged presidential system or some sort of governance system. They are constitutional monarchies where the monarchies play as as a signatory of the constitution and whatever happens behind the scenes. And then there is a layer of um, constitution where the prime minister and all that election and all that happens. Okay, but basically to take the power away from the monarchies. But is that really true? There is the if the power has already been taken or not, only time will decide. But I think that's not the case. Okay, you don't become minority to just give up your powers just like that. Okay, influence is still there. Okay, maybe for not for Portuguese or Spanish and all that, but France still, I think Dutch Empire still. This is why if you look into it, then lots and lots of illegal migration and all that thing is happening in what in these places, like right here, right here, right here, right here, right here, right here. All this is hub of illegal migration. These are the places that talk about what they talk about climate change and all too. Nobody else talks about. I mean, others do. They have joined the club, climate change and blah blah blah. But these are primary stakeholders in this whole thing. Okay. Now, if I will get into all this thing, then the story is gonna go in a whole different direction. So let's stick with the Monroe Doctrine. Okay. But all right. So now we talked about what European empires were there. Okay, and why Monroe Doctrine required to warn these folks way ahead of time to stay out. Okay. Now So, but the question really is that why Monroe Doctrine is back. Hmm? See, for a long time, for almost 3 4 decades after the Cold War, that the US assumed that hemisphere was basically geopolitically quiet. Why? Because for at least 30 40 years, 70s, 80s, 90s, especially I would say 70s, 80s, 90s, actually no, sorry, 90s Soviet Union was gone, right? So after that Cold War ended. So 90s and then after that till now, basically US thought uh that this whole thing is geopolitically quiet, nobody's gonna do anything and this and that. But when when the US started to look at the data, the trade data, when they started to look at other things, like for example, the Panama Canal. Panama Canal is still, just for those who don't know, Panama Canal is still is not actually under US control. Yes, President Trump did talk about buying it and this and that, but BlackRock simply refused it. They're not going to do that. And Panama Canal is just sitting there under Chinese control. Now, so that became a problem. All right. Especially when earlier I said that the whole entire thing, when your neighbors start to raise their voice against you, like for example Canada, Mexico, Nicaragua, Caribbean, Cuba, all these countries, they start to make threats and do all those things, then you start to pay close attention to it. Hey, nobody is actually respecting us, especially in this hemisphere. If we are not being respected in our own backyard, then how can we expect it to happen in the rest of the world? So, so US recently during the President Trump's time, they came up with the new national security strategy document, and in that document, they came up with this Monroe Doctrine that hey, we cannot control the whole entire world considering the economic situation, and this is how every empire basically falls if they don't learn from their mistakes. Okay, so what we are seeing is the learning from the mistake of overextending, having too many bases, dumping too much money into uh, wars that never happened. Mm. For example, dumping money into NATO, what that is, it's just a war that never happened, right? That never happened, meaning that these people, they sit there and they anticipate wars. And then what they do is that in that anticipation, they go and preemptively find reasons to attack other countries, small countries, so that they can continue these wars. Now, who actually does that? Okay. Remember, I talked about the empires here. Hmm? So some of these empires are actually, they have infiltrated into the US system. Okay. And what they do is that they have been dragging US into unwanted wars. Now, what that unwanted war leads to is that US gets involved into the war, its economy is hurt, everything happens, but people who actually get US involved into it, they make money through other things behind the scenes. Okay, that's why they want long-term wars. US never gets involved into short-term 3 or 4 day wars. US always has been involved into long-term wars. So up until now, this whole thing was being hidden. The excuse used to be that, oh, military industrial complex, military industrial complex, war economy. Well, military industrial complex, regardless of what it is, but at the end of the day, it still responds to US government's demands. If US government is not going to order anything, then how the military industrial complex, why the military industrial complex would do something? So clearly there are things that have been pushing the buttons behind the scenes, and those were the things. Okay. Now, uh, so why this whole thing happened after 2024? Okay, after 2024, what happened is that we saw lots of changes. One of those changes were uh, that trade in national currency started. countries started to reject the whole sanctions and all. Countries have started to move into the digital currency era and all that. Okay. Now, I will tell you one thing, that if anything, de-dollarization will never kill the dollar. Actually, if anyone thinks that de-dollarization is going to kill the dollar, then they are dead wrong. What will kill the dollar instantly is the rise of digital currency. If the digital currency comes out like CBDCs, okay, with gold backed CBDCs from India, Russia, China, and there are, I mean, pretty much the whole entire world is right now moving towards CBDCs. So, so why CBDCs will kill it? CBDCs will kill it because it will come with its own payment system. It will be easy to integrate with other countries. Hmm? So, and it will automatically come with its own settlement and all that, right? So when that happens, then lots and lots of countries are going to participate in it really, really fast. And when that happens, then dollar use will automatically decline, and that's gonna kill the dollar right away. Okay. Now, why I'm talking about it though? I'm talking about it because the Monroe Doctrine is back. Monroe Doctrine is back because these are the things that are happening in our own backyard. Okay. For example, Brazil is working on digital currency. Argentina, even though they are moving their economy towards the dollar and all, but Argentina has also been looking into the whole digital currency. There are a few other countries in South American continent where they have been looking for digital currencies as well. Now, why Western Hemisphere? Why limit to Western Hemisphere? See, every power, every great power, sooner or later, when they lose the grip over their economy, that happened from 2022 onwards, that when the auto pen was running the whole entire system. Now, if you go look into the data, okay, when you go look into the data, you find that since 2020, there has been an attempt to actually push the digital currency CBDC in the US market, or to convert the dollar into CBDCs. And there was a survey that was released in 2020. And then when the survey was released, then public, actually US public, American public, they simply said no to it. Why? Because they don't want anybody controlling their money. And if you don't know, then there is a process called debanking. Lots and lots of these people have been influential people, in fact, have been debanked. What is debanking? Debanking is the process where all these banks, they can actually choose to simply deny access to you to your own money. And there was a lawsuit over this, which actually later on was won by the plaintiff, and they were like, okay, so the court basically ruled that you cannot deny anybody their money. You have to provide that. That's the service. So that's recently all that was sorted out, but the debanking process was there. And so that's one of the things that the US public was worried, that if they go with CBDCs, then it turns out that the US government is basically denying them their own money. They're stealing their own money. They're trying to track where you are. You're losing the privacy. Why? Because it will be centralized, right? So, but with cash, you can still hide if there is a situation. But with CBDCs, you cannot. Even though lots of countries who are implementing CBDCs, they say that yeah, we will keep all that anonymous and this and that, but how much anonymity we are gonna keep it, or how much anonymous is gonna be, only time will tell over there, right? But anyways, coming to the point, when that happened, all the attempts were made to actually destabilize the US economy and push it into hyperinflation. Now, when you push an economy into hyperinflation, then automatically the first course of action any country will do is that they will stop printing the money. Hard currency immediately is the first thing to go. That's what happens. And immediately currency will be devalued, and they are going to start to move to digital currency. All right, that was the whole plan. If you look into it, since 2020 onwards, every attempt was made to basically devalue the dollar and create the hyperinflation. Okay, after COVID. So even though I think that in the early 2020s, when the CBDC was introduced and it was COVID era, so probably, and this is another thought process that I have, is that probably US government probably thought that if they will print too much hard currency, then it's gonna actually create inflation, and of course the current economic situation. So probably that's why they thought that if they move to digital currency, which is not something that happens overnight or in 6 months, it takes lots of work and speed to really do that type of thing, and lots of experiment pilot programs and all that. So my take was that probably this is a second theory, that because they realize that they will have to print lots and lots of dollars. So because of that, they figured that if it will be good and it will be a lot easier, and it can be, they can avoid the economic debacle of the currency if they simply do this as a digital currency. That was the whole intent, probably. But that's not the point here. Point is that um, all that attempt was made and economic situation worsened. So outside the, so for us it became very hard to really manage these things, especially if you look into the choke points that us controlled back in the day. Okay, just till 2024 they controlled the choke point around the Suez Canal, then certain things in the Indian Ocean region, then Asia Pacific region, then uh, in the South American region, and all those things were there. They at also they thought. Now, when they started to look things closely, they found they don't even control the Panama Canal. Forget the rest. Suez Canal is controlled by Egypt, and uh, when Houthis started to attack, after Israel Hamas war, the Houthis started to attack the cargo ships and all. US tried to attack them, but then they realized that actually uh, they're running thin. They don't have enough resources or any firepower to really go and do some damage without taking the loss. Why? Because Houthis are firing cheap ass rockets and you are firing $1 million missile. Of course, that's not economically very good option. So the amount of money they're gonna dump into uh destroying Houthis and all that, so that they can secure the supply chain, that's not even worth it. That's not even worth securing the supply chain. It's best that let them destroy the ship. But so all that, when all that happened, and finally US was financially running thin, long story short, so they realized that it's best to focus. Focus where? On the Western Hemisphere. And Hemisphere happens to be these countries, Canada, then in a way Greenland and all that, Alaska, Greenland, then you go come down to South America and all that. So all this is the Western Hemisphere, okay? So how the Americas though became contested, right? I talked about what exactly happened, and I talked about, so far we talked about uh what was the Monroe Doctrine, how all these empires could have threatened, and then we talked about why US is now focusing on the Western Hemisphere, right? But the question now is, the most important question is how Western Hemisphere became contested and how US is seeing the threat here. Okay. Now, so for that, let's look into some of the numbers. All right. Some of the numbers are: US runs a good trade deficit of almost 188.7 billion within the Western Hemisphere. Okay. And deficit is driven mainly by Canada and Mexico, reflecting integrated supply chains, not a strategic dependence. All right. Now, at the same time, China's Latin America trade exceeded what? $500 billion in 2024, which is a historic high. All right. Now, China is now a top two trading partner for most of the South America. And that too with the trade surplus, not the trade deficit. You have to understand this. not with the trade surplus. It's with the trade surplus, not with the trade deficit. Now, if China is trading in Latin America, you have to understand one thing: the Chinese strategy to trade is very simple, and I have said this many times, and I'm saying it again. The Chinese strategy to trade is to simply eliminate the local business, any local competitor that's out there. They want to eliminate it by lowering the cost so much that people don't even think about anything else. Okay, so which means that if China has entered the market and their trade just continuously is growing, then sooner or later, if US is even thinking about manufacturing, now thinking about manufacturing, then they won't be able to sell their product even in their own backyard, and that is a serious problem. Why? Because if you look into it, we are talking about $500 billion. China's trade $500 billion plus. Okay, now that $500 billion trade could be for US too. US could actually manufacture and sell that much $500 billion worth of trade or product in the Latin America actually. But who is doing it? China is doing it. Isn't the, is it good in any way? No, it's not. US GDP, if you look at, I made a video on GDP too. So US GDP, if you look into it, then the US GDP is $29 trillion around that. Okay. And if you look into the NDP data of it, then you find that the productive GDP is only 65% of the actual GDP. What is productive GDP? Productive GDP meaning that the money that comes from the actual trade, the return of investment that you get. Otherwise, for the most part, it is just what? Taxing people. Taxing people, now add tariff to the list, or the homeowners that are being double charged for home ownership, and they're considered also the renters too. So if home ownership is, say, contributes $2 trillion, just the home ownership, then rentership also is double. So that's at $2 trillion. So just with that, $4 trillion gets added into the GDP. So actually, the productive GDP is 65% of the original, or say the projected GDP, that is $29 trillion. So if you do the 65% of it, you will see it comes down to $19 trillion around that. So that's what America's GDP actually is, and that explains you that why the country is overextended in everything. If a country has $29 trillion of GDP with 330 million population, do you really believe that inflation will be this high and people won't have a job and this and that? $29 trillion is a lot of money. So what exactly is the problem then? Why GDP, that high GDP, doesn't even look like high GDP? It's simply because it's fake. It's fake. The numbers are all fake. So, how do you make the productive GDP? How do you introduce the productive GDP, or how much, how you actually get the return of investment? It's by the trade, by trade. This Chinese trade that is $500 billion in your own backyard, that should be America's trade in its own backyard, and that too should be surplus, not deficit. Okay. Now, so what kind of trade this is? Trade has been followed by ports, logistic hubs, energy projects, and digital infrastructure and all that. Now think about it. Chinese, so-called Chinese cargo ships on the South American ports. How do you know that they are cargo ships? Chinese have actually, just few years ago, Chinese were running this program of converting their cargo ships into the military ships. That's what they were doing. How fast they can convert their each and every cargo ship that's out there. In fact, not just cargo ships, even the fishing ship boats and all that, into full-fledged war fighting machine. They have done these exercises. So it's not just about fighting the war, but if an outside country has influence in your trade and all that, and the neighboring ports and all that, then we have a problem, right? So so what the inference of this whole thing is, that Western hemisphere is no longer economically monopolized by the US. Economic gravity is now multipolar in your own backyard. That's the thing. Okay, and that's why the Western hemisphere has become contested. All right. Now, so okay, trade is fine, all that good stuff is fine and all that. But the real question now again is, what actually spooked the United States? That's the thing, right? What actually spooked the United States is something like this. Okay. So China is, now let me show you, let me actually show you the actual data. All right. Now let's look at this. What do you see here? What do you see is the China's oil investment in Venezuela. Okay. So what this is saying is that China is a major customer of an investor in Venezuela's oil sector, which President Donald Trump aims to revive following US military ouster of President Nicolas Maduro on Saturday. And I will get into the oil too. Okay. Yes, it is um as it's not, it is oil, it could be oil and all that, but it's not what you think it is. Okay. And I will explain that to you why. All right. Now let's look at this data real quick here. Just the data. I'm not gonna spend too much time into it. Okay. Much of exported oil is sold to China. Okay. There are no other importers. India used to import through Chevron, and that was through the, because India had the exception of that. Okay. The sanction exception, exemption, or you can call it. Okay. Beijing declares very little, imports are often rebranded. Import hits 470 billions per day, billion barrels per day during 2025, according to energy analyst firm Vertex, or roughly 4.5% of China's seaborne crude imports. Small independent refiners known as teapots are main Chinese buyers of discounted Venezuelan crude. Okay. Now let's look at this number. Chinese states from hold largest oil claims among foreign firms. Okay. What do you see? Sinopec Group China, Russia, CNPC China, Chevron. Look at Chevron. Chevron is the only company that's there. But rest of it, Vietnam, Venezuela, only two Venezuelan companies. Rest is Spain, Italy, Vietnam. But mainly, what do you see? Mainly, you see Chinese companies. Okay. Chinese companies have invested and they are drilling left and right in the Venezuelan oil. That's what it is. Okay. So the tanker that was hit, the shadow fleet that was hit, it was the Chinese ship. Okay. So now, if you look at these numbers, Chinese investors poured 2.1 billion into the country's oil sector after 2016, according to the 2023 estimate. Okay. Now, all this is good. These are the numbers that are there. Okay. So, what is the problem? Okay. This is what the number is. The problem is this. Right here is the problem, that China's two-way trade with Western Hemisphere is roughly $1.2 trillion a year. When you combine China's basically Caribbean and Latin American, this is $515 billion. US China goods trade is $582 billion. And Canada China goods trade. I'm not talking about the services yet, okay? $118 billion, which is converted to US dollars. Now you have to understand that it's not just the dollar. China also is heavily invested in Yuan in the Venezuelan oil industry. Okay. And China select trade alone exceeded what? This $500 billion. The key currency distinction is pricing versus settlement, right? A cargo can be priced off a dollar benchmark but settled through non-dollar channels. Okay, you can benchmark all that thing, but at the end of the day, you can actually settle it through non-dollar, that is yuan. Right. So China has been pushing what? China has been pushing these renminbis, that is their yuan. Okay, cross-border payments. So what China has is still minority currency globally, but Swift trackers show that 3.17% of global payments by value in September 2025. And this is because China individually is trading with these countries in its own currency. So, and China has also promoted the yuan denominated credit to the region, okay, including a $10 billion yuan credit line for Latin American countries. So that's what is going on, and that's what actually spooked US. Remember, if you don't remember, I will remind you that President Trump said what? President Trump said that Dollar is the problem. If you simply go against the dollar, if you try to undermine the dollar, then America will have problem with it. He said that losing dollar is battle of dollar is like losing a war, and which is true to an extent. Okay. Now, so what is America's biggest fear then? America's biggest fear is that America can tolerate the trade deficit and all. Okay. But it is very far less tolerant towards what? The financial settlement rails in its own hemisphere. Okay. So when countries like China, look at Brazil has been talking, Brazil talks about trading in national currencies. It does trade in national currencies. Okay. Then there are a few other countries in South American region that trade in the national currencies. They don't even trade in dollar. So what do you think is going to happen? Hmm? Now, today, if China is heavily, I will give you a scenario. Just think about it. Okay, if China is heavily invested, okay, if China is heavily invested in the Venezuelan oil industry, in the Venezuelan oil, then today they are just settling things in yuan. But down the line, what if this is how they go and control other wells and all that, and then they drill oil from there and they start to sell that oil in what? In yuan. And petro yuan will be born in the Western Hemisphere, not in the Middle East, not somewhere else, in the Western Hemisphere. If you let it go and ignore it long enough, hmm, then that is a possibility. I mean, it is already happening, but meaning that your own currency is not being used in your own backyard, let alone anything else. So that becomes a threat. Hence the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, that's what the whole point of Monroe Doctrine was. So it's not just that European countries. Now actually there are other players as well that will not be allowed in the hemisphere. So Monroe Doctrine is still applies. It applies to the Europe as well. So anybody in the Europe thinks that no, it's not doesn't apply to them. No, no, bitch, it applies to you as well. So don't get all happy about it. All right. So that's what it is, guys. This is how what's going on, and this is the biggest fear that US had. Okay. And this is one of the things. This is now I just presented to you with data and facts on the ground. All right. Now, why Maduro was captured, I think that when we start to see arrests happening within the country, we will know exactly why. I have made a video on that, so please go and check it out. And I'll post those videos too, and you can look it up and just do watch it. You will understand a lot about things. Okay. So I hope, guys, you learned something, you enjoyed the video. Please do like and subscribe, and I will talk to you guys in another video. Take care.